I've never been to war, but my entire life was controlled by the Vietnam War from 1960 to 1975. Most people here probably, well, some of you look like you may remember some of those times. I'll tell you what it was like for me. My father died in 1960 suddenly, and that probably is the major thing that had an effect on my life. What they say is that you really only experience death once, even though you see a lot of people die. But the first time when you realize what it means, that the person is not going to be there anymore. I mean, I had stepped on ants before, but didn't have the same effect as the death of my father. I had a couple of immediate reactions when he died, which it took me 10 years to remember, because they were not acceptable. First reaction was I was furious with him for dying on me. It was extremely inconsiderate of him. There was a 15-year-old boy who needed his father. The second reaction was even worse. If one of my parents had to die, I wish it had been my mother. 10 years later, I remembered it in therapy. It's just absurd to try and understand what death means and what Memorial Day means. But they're very closely tied together. Memorial Day originally started apparently as Decoration Day in 1865, and it was first observed as a result of the Civil War, and apparently there was quite a bit of black and white issues that took place, but Decoration Day was a way that the black people managed to worship and, in fact, decorate the graves of the people who had died in the Civil War. It later got co-opted, and the Southern and Northern issues became major, as did the black and white issues, and they still go on to this day. War, to me, is absurd, and yet the positions are extreme, and as someone who's studied how the mind works for his entire life, I realize it comes down to the fact that we're all animals. That animals basically have three reactions which go back millions of years, and those are fight, flight, freeze. And there's a part of our brain that reacts that way: fight, flight, freeze. So you've got lions, you've got rabbits, you've got possums. And all of us have a part of our brain which operates that way. The part of the brain that's been around for now 300,000 years, the frontal cortex, that part of the brain tends to be subjugated by the fight, flight, freeze reaction. And this good guy, bad guy, you know, it's been around for quite a while. But it's the reaction, the result of the fight, flight, freeze reaction. The truth is that everything winds up polarized in that part of the brain. And I've had to deal with it inside the minds of myself and the people I've been meeting with over the years. At any rate, my experience was 1961, I went to college, and that was a school which a lot of people revere. I'm not sure I do. It's Harvard. 1960, John F. Kennedy was elected president. He robbed Harvard of all of their major brains. And then in 1961 and 62, Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert were two psychology professors who were kicked out for passing out LSD to undergraduates. I was an undergraduate, and I'm not sure I got any from them, but I did do a bit of LSD. I understand we have an experiment that's going to be going on in this town fairly soon with that. At any rate, 1963, Kennedy got shot, and just before that, there had been this Bay of Pigs business, which was a total failure on his part, but those of us at Harvard were ready to take up arms and go to Cuba and fight bad Castro. After Kennedy was shot, a lot of the thoughts that he had and a lot of the things he wanted to do, which had been totally eliminated and denied in Congress, not too dissimilar to some things that are happening recently here. Fortunately, LBJ Johnson wound up taking up and passing nearly all of the programs that he had, which would have just died in the water otherwise. My issue was the draft. And everything, I wanted to quit school. I knew I could do school, I didn't know I could do life. So I had decided I was going to quit school. My mother decided that she didn't want me to quit school, and she was a lawyer. She did free legal work for the clerk of my draft board. And in return asked that I be told I'd be the first person drafted and sent to Vietnam if I quit school. I wound up walking into New York City with $2 in my pocket, relatives in Yonkers, and ready to die rather than contact them, see if I could do life. About 3 weeks later, I figured I could. But the best way to do it was to say that I was a high school dropout and not a Harvard sophomore. The reality, though, is that I stayed at college, and in 1965 I graduated and went into a program in clinical psychology, a doctoral program at Boston University. And in 1966, 1 year after I entered that program, it stopped being a way of getting out of the draft to be a graduate student. So I had to leave. At that point, the next best way to get a deferment was to be working at a place that would write you a letter that said you were necessary and essential to their functioning, and that had to be a nonprofit. So I worked for 3 years at a school for delinquents. And just as I was about to turn 26, this was before, by the way, the draft numbers came around. Just before I was about to turn 26, I was called for a physical. And I had to decide. I said, okay, am I going to go to Canada? Because that was the thing to do at that point. And I decided I couldn't live with myself if I did, but I thought I'd fight it every way I could. And about a week before my physical, I was at that time working at a school for emotionally disturbed boys, and went to an orthopedic surgeon who lived very near where the school was, and said, gee, I've had trouble with my back about, once or twice a year, and I wonder if you'd take a look at it. And she said, why are you really here? And I said, I don't want to go to Vietnam. And it turned out that she was a graduate of McGill, which is a school in Canada, and she was sympathetic. Whether that had anything to do with the letter she wrote, which got me out of the physical, I don't know. But I have a feeling it did, since I've only had problems with my back about 4 times in the last 30 years. At any rate, everything about my life was controlled by the draft. And I had decided I would actually go if I had to go. I had also decided that I would not fire my gun if I was given a gun. And there were a lot of reasons for that, but it basically came down to the fact that I could not take another life. At the same time, the literature shows that about 30 to 35% of the people who were in combat never fired their guns. And when you start talking about Memorial Day, the truth is you're talking about life and death, and an issue where people my age, or people even 40 or 50 years younger than I, there wouldn't be any wars if we had to go fight. 18-year-olds don't understand life and death. They really don't. They have no idea what it is. In fact, the studies of the brain show that the brain is not formulated really until about age 25. So what it comes down to is war, of course, is total baloney. It's this part of the brain that breaks everything down into good and bad, good guys, bad guys, black and white, whatever the heck it is. It doesn't matter. What does matter is that it changes our lives. So what's the bottom line? From my point of view, it's that nobody gets out of life alive. It's all about how you significate it. And that's a word that I made up. What meaning you give. What meaning you give to the experiences you have. The only real thing that we know is that after you die, the way in which you're remembered is in the minds and hearts of those who care about you. And that's what today is about. Thank you.